Lecture 30. Today we're going to talk about the origins of the American Civil War. I want to take a moment here in the beginning of this lecture to discuss sectionalism in a bit more detail. We brought this up last time when we talked about the Mexican War and how that conflict tended to divide Americans north and south over the issue of slavery. Let's go further and talk about a couple of other interpretations of sectionalism. There's a cultural interpretation that says that North and South are so different that a breakup is inevitable, that the North is a free society, a dynamic society of diverse economic interest, a more egalitarian society, whereas the South is a very static society, a strict hierarchy of slave owners, whites, and then a vast slave population at the bottom of the hierarchy. An economy that's part capitalist and part almost reminiscent of feudalism in Europe. Two very different cultures. And this interpretation suggests that a breakup is inevitable because of these differences. Now, there's an economic interpretation of sectionalism as well. And this goes to the fact that the North tends to be a manufacturing section of the country, the South an agricultural portion of the country. The North seeking tariffs to protect domestic industry. The South, of course, loathes the tariff because it makes the price of imported goods higher, and it takes money out of the pockets of Europeans, money that otherwise would go to the purchase of cotton. So there are distinctly different economic interests between the two sides. Of course, the racial aspect of sectionalism is obvious. You have a free society in the North, an egalitarian society, and you have a slave society in the South, a society of strict hierarchies. So these interpretations of sectionalism are worth keeping in mind as we move forward and watch the events that will break the country into two halves. If we want to start with long-term causes of the Civil War, I guess you could go to the United States Constitution. Slavery is embedded in the Constitution. I believe it's Article 1, Section 2 that discusses the 3/5 clause. Southerners desired the 3/5 clause, whereby slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This is for the purposes of representation in the Congress. As you know, we do a census every 10 years to determine state populations. And then congressmen are awarded to states based on population. So the 3/5 clause essentially artificially raises the population of the South, allowing Southerners to have more representation in Washington. This increases their political power. Southerners are fearful that the North is outracing them in population. And of course, slaves are property. They are not citizens and enjoy no rights at all. So this is a bit of a ballet here to get chattel slaves in the position of increasing the population of the South through the 3/5 clause. Now, I've heard a historian remark once that the Constitution is in effect a pro-slavery document. You can still get a fight started with arguments like this. And again, this demonstrates something that we should all realize, and that is the history is not past. We still fight it out, these historical issues, on a regular basis. Another long-term cause of the American Civil War is the Louisiana Purchase. We've talked about this in the past. Jefferson purchases at least the rights to Louisiana from Napoleon, 1803, 1804. The question that has to be determined here is how to organize Louisiana. Is it going to be free or is it going to be slave? The attempt to answer this question comes in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. And you can look at the maps here to understand this. The new state of Missouri is brought into the Union as a slave state. Now, to keep the regional balance, a new free state is brought into the Union as well. Here, we slice off a portion of Massachusetts, that portion called Maine, and we bring Maine in as a new free state. This maintains the regional balance. The southern boundary of Missouri, on the 3630 line, the latitude line that runs there. South of that line may be organized as slave. North of that line is to be organized as free territory. So the Missouri Compromise is an attempt to answer the question, how are we going to organize the Louisiana Purchase? Next, I'm just going to mention the abolitionists again. Their incessant and harsh criticism of the South over the period of a few decades, from the 1830s all the way up through the war, tends to alienate Southerners and make them feel perhaps unwelcome in their own country. The war with Mexico, we talked last time, and we discussed how it contributed to sectionalism, with many people across the country divided on whether Texas should be annexed, on whether we should be engaged in this conflict with Mexico. Two prominent Americans both believe that the war with Mexico was unjust. Both Abraham Lincoln, as a young congressman from Illinois, and a young officer in the United States Army, U.S. Grant, would both remark that this was an unjust war that we should not be engaged in. So you can see that Mexico contributes to sectionalism. Now, we're awarded the Mexican cession as a result of this war, and we have to decide how to organize it, slave or free. The Compromise of 1850 attempts to do this. And the Compromise of 1850 has a couple of clauses, or a couple of parts that I want to highlight. One, California is brought into the nation quickly as a free state. You'll remember that gold was discovered in California in 1849. So the Compromise of 1850 brings California in quickly as settlers rush to Sutter's Mill to get rich. Now, at the same time, the other portions, the New Mexico Territory, the Utah Territory, it is going to be determined that the decision on how to organize this will be left to the people themselves, the settlers. This is called popular sovereignty. Pop, the Latin prefix pertaining to people, sovereignty pertaining to rule. The people are going to rule or decide in this case. This is a good way for politicians to get off the hook, isn't it? They don't have to make this decision. We can leave it to the people to decide. The Compromise of 1850 has in it as well a Fugitive Slave Act. This tends to make everyone in the country complicit in slavery, as Northerners are now obligated to help return escaped slaves to their proper owners in the South. Now, the Compromise of 1850 and this Fugitive Slave Act will inspire a novel, a best-selling novel, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well. You've undoubtedly heard of it. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this novel is going to contribute to sectionalism. Stowe's portrayal of the slave South infuriates Southerners, and it alienates Northerners as well. Many Northerners, this is their first look at the South's peculiar institution, and they don't like it. Southerners, of course, are angry that their institutions are being held up for ridicule and harsh criticism in this book. I've heard a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it goes like this. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was only about 4'11", I think, she went to the White House during the war to meet with President Lincoln. And you've all seen pictures of Lincoln. He looks like he's 9 feet tall with that stovepipe hat on. And legend has it, as Lincoln leaned over to shake hands with Stowe, he said, "So you're the little lady who started this war." Again, this emphasizes the role that the novel had in contributing to sectionalism, breaking the country into two parts. The next long-term cause of the war, I guess we could go with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is an attempt by the Congress to organize the remainder of the old Louisiana territory. The Kansas and Nebraska territories are formed, and again, it's decided, as it was with the Mexican Cession, it's decided to allow popular sovereignty to decide the question of slave or free. This, of course, obliterates the Missouri Compromise and the Missouri Compromise line, that 3630 line that ran along the southern border of Missouri. Now, this Kansas-Nebraska Act, opening the Kansas territory to slavery, is going to create a little mini civil war in Kansas, sort of a preview of coming attractions. If you like the conflict in Kansas, you're going to love the big feature that's coming up in a couple of years. Pro-slavery people move into Kansas, free soil people move into Kansas, and the two begin to battle it out. A pro-slavery constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, is published. People are getting killed. John Brown goes there with his sons, and they slaughter a group of Southerners, not slave owners, but people presumably sympathetic with slavery. So historians and newspaper editors at the time refer to this as Bleeding Kansas. Again, sort of a preview of the carnage that's going to come very shortly. The next incident that I'm going to bring up here as a contributor to sectionalism is called the Sumner-Brooks Affair. Charles Sumner is a radical Republican senator from Massachusetts, and he's closely affiliated with the abolitionist cause. He rises in the Senate and makes a speech condemning the South and its peculiar institution of slavery. This speech arouses the anger of a young Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina. Brooks goes to Sumner's desk there on the floor of the United States Senate and takes his cane and begins to beat Sumner severely over the head and shoulders with his cane. This beating was so severe that Sumner nearly died, and I think, in fact, he was out of the Senate recovering for about 2 years. Now, this probably would not be worthy of mentioning if these two men were fighting over a woman, for instance. But the fact that the fight was over slavery on the United States Senate with this violence made it symbolic of sectionalism and the breaking up of the country. This was not helped, of course, by the fact that Southerners applauded Brooks's action, this violence, while the abolitionists and many Northerners were appalled by it. Typical hot-headed Southerner thinking with his fist instead of with his brains. Now, I should mention that Preston Brooks broke his cane over Sumner's head. He rapidly became the owner of the largest cane collection in the world, as Southerners sent him new canes to replace the one that he had broken over this radical Republican abolitionist head, Charles Sumner. So the Sumner-Brooks affair, highly publicized. There are artistic renditions of it in the newspapers. And you can see how it drives this wedge between the two sides once again. The last thing I'm going to mention in this lecture, in these long-term causes, is the Dred Scott case. This is a case familiar to most Americans. You learned about it in high school. Dred Scott was a slave. I believe his owner was a U.S. Army officer. He was transferred to the Northern Territories, Free Territory. Dred Scott sued for his freedom once he reached, I believe it was Minnesota or Wisconsin. I can't remember exactly. This case went to the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a Virginian, wrote the majority opinion, and he said, see if I can remember this quote, he said that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. This, of course, further divides the country. The abolitionists and many Northerners are appalled that the Supreme Court appears to be in the hands of the slave power. Southerners, of course, are applauding the Supreme Court for upholding their peculiar institution. I'm going to stop there for this lecture, and we will pick up the short-term causes of the Civil War when we return. Thank you.